Hey Delco, we're excited that you're joining us as we look at Ecclesiastes again.
This week, we are looking at what the Bible in Ecclesiastes says about justice. And the way I think about it in my head is kind of like justice and injustice, or how the world is fair or not fair, and how we talked about together, Steve and I talked about how chance in this world can often feel like injustice, the bad things that happen to us. Or on Sunday we'll talk about like what happened. What do you say to someone when they draw the short straw?
Yeah, think about that question.
Yeah.
What do you say to the person who draws the short straw?
But before we go into that, we're going to jump in and see, look at a few other passages in the Old Testament about justice. Isaiah 58:68 says, "Loose the bonds of wickedness, let the oppressed go free, share bread with hungry, house the homeless, and cover the naked." It has those ideas in there. Jeremiah 7:6 says, "If you do not oppress the sojourner, the fatherless, or the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own harm, then I will let you dwell in this place, in the land that I have of old to your father forever." So that's just that idea of treating people fairly and having justice in the land. Ezekiel 22:7 says, "Father and mother are treated with contempt in you. The sojourner suffers extortion in your midst. The fatherless and the widow are wronged in you." So that one's a negative one, showing you how you are treating people unjustly.
God's judging Israel for that.
Yeah. Then Zechariah 7:10 says, "Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor, and let none of you despise evil against one another in your heart."
It's like the same group of people that God's mentioning through the prophets over and over.
Yeah, the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner. And then in the New Testament, Matthew 23:23 says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness."
The words of Jesus. Yeah, so today, that's like Randy just gave us a brief picture of some of the verses that the Old Testament has about justice, very much a concern for the vulnerable among us. And in Ecclesiastes, there's points where it almost appears as if the author is saying justice is meaningless. And he has these observations where he says, this is meaningless, this is vanity. The same thing we've been talking about each week. The Hebrew word that is translated as meaningless or vanity, which is spread all throughout Ecclesiastes. You can't miss those words if you're reading it, vanity or meaningless. The Hebrew word is hevel, and we're indebted to the Bible Project and how they talk about this word. They say that can also be translated as smoke or vapor. And it's helpful to think of every time you see the word meaningless or vanity, it's almost as if the author's literally saying money is like smoke, justice is like smoke, wisdom is like smoke. And it's not necessarily saying that these things are bad. It's just saying that they're temporary or fleeting. There's something that, just like smoke, where it's there for a moment and then it fades away, or it feels like you can grab onto it, but your hand passes through it. It's just outside of our grasp. And these things aren't meaningless when we have the wrong expectations concerning them. So if you read through the book of Ecclesiastes, a lot of it is from the perspective of this king, and it feels like he's just wandering his kingdom, and he's like, it's like we're walking along next to him, and he's telling us all these observations. He's like, hey, you see over there, that person who's been working his whole life is going to have nobody to give it to. Toil is meaningless. Toil is like a smoke. It'll fade away. Can't grab onto it. So we've been kind of using that illustration, and we've said how, as we've been walking around Delaware, we see how COVID-19 has resulted in the closing of many shops downtown. So we concluded that careers can be meaningless. We've talked about how President Hayes isn't really remembered in this town. So was his wisdom really have any meaning? So today, Randy's going to kind of share our experience of driving through Delaware. Randy, you were driving through Delaware. What did you see?
Yeah, so I was driving through Delaware and just thinking about, once again, just COVID and different small businesses that may or may not be closing. Who knows yet? And I drove by the what's it called?
The food truck depot.
Food truck depot with like those sand volleyball courts right in town. And I just thought, like, man, last summer they worked so hard on getting that running. And then by the end of the summer they had it running and it was awesome. I never went, but I would see people there. We need to go. But then of course, like, it's summertime, and because of COVID, nobody's playing volleyball at those sand courts, and I don't really see anybody at the food trucks. And I just thought, like, man, they put so much work and effort into this business that they have, and like they were trying to do something good for the community and bring people together to play volleyball, something different and fun, a way to experience life. And man, their hard work, it just doesn't seem fair because of COVID now. Like, I mean, I think they're still operating and stuff, but they can't fully do what they were made to do, and it just doesn't seem fair. And then, like, the next day I was driving with Steven, and I once again, I was just thinking about COVID, and I happened to see one of those like quick cash now businesses. And I thought, I wonder if those guys are getting way more business at a time like this because people have been put on unemployment or lost their jobs and sometimes need quick cash now. And I thought, man, that doesn't quite seem fair either, because sometimes you hear about places like that who kind of prey on the needy, or they aren't necessarily bettering the lives of the people that they're serving. Sometimes you can hear some negative stories about places like that, and I thought, man, for some of those businesses to be thriving at a time like this also doesn't seem fair, especially for the people who may end up in a worse place because of it. So I was just thinking about the comparison of, like, I don't know, people who have really worked hard and bad things have happened, and then people who maybe not even like quick cash now places, but other people who maybe aren't making the right choices but are thriving. And you can see that all over our world. Just doesn't seem just. It doesn't seem fair. So
yeah, there's like moments where the vulnerable aren't being treated fairly. You use that word fair, and I think we do have a sense of like what is fair. Even like as a kid, remember, it was always like, but my brother or sister got this and I didn't, and we want justice. Like we tell our mom, we would like tattle on our brother and sister because they did something wrong. Like this sense of like fairness, I think, really is wired in us. So Randy kind of pointed at this example of how we could conclude, like, well, is justice meaningless? Because it looks like the people who kind of painted the picture of the volleyball courts as like a hard worker. We don't know who they are, but it feels like
just making assumptions.
Yeah, just making assumptions. But it feels like they are suffering in a place that maybe preying on the vulnerable could be thriving in this season, and that just doesn't seem right. So why are we tempted to like value justice? Well, we just read in the Old Testament, God like calls us to it. Justice is a good thing. And Ecclesiastes, it speaks of morally neutral things, kind of like our career or money, how these things can be meaningless if we place them, like if we find value in them apart from God. But it also speaks to how these morally good things can feel meaningless at times, whether it's relationships because you find that you're alone, you have no one to help you up when you fall. Wisdom, if you expect it to make you someone that's remembered, wisdom's going to be meaningless. And here we have the author saying that justice can feel meaningless. And really, it's not that they're meaningless because they're not good. It has everything to do with our expectations concerning them. We cannot expect unfortunately, on this side of eternity, on this side of Jesus coming back, we cannot expect justice to always be enduring. In fact, oftentimes it's fragile. And we often also, especially today, we see people pursuing justice apart from God. And I think Brad, I've heard in some of the conversations I've had with him, it seems like our culture wants some of these Christian values around justice, but the culture does not want God attached to it. And we're almost divorcing justice from the Lord. And when these things are happening, justice will be meaningless. It'll be that much more unenduring. So what does Ecclesiastes specifically say about justice?
Yeah, well, before I go into that, as you're talking, I was just thinking about how, like, there are things in life that we can have justice in. Like, we do have court systems, and a lot of times the judge is making the right call, and like there is justice in this world. But then you think of, like, in life, though, it will never be perfect. You will not ever have a fully just life. Just because we live in a broken world,
It's almost like if you had a good bowl of ice cream, and then I remember when I was a little kid, I got this bowl of ice cream on a camping trip, and one of those huge mosquitoes. They were like those huge suckers that flew like right and landed on my neck, and you could like hear it buzzing in your ear. And my immediate response was just to go like that. You know how like you respond to bugs before you even process that they're there? And I went like that, and the bug fell down right into my ice cream, and I had this big mosquito just laying in my ice cream. And it ruined the whole thing. There was all that good stuff to eat, and there was a much smaller mosquito compared to all the ice cream in my bowl, and it ruined the whole thing. Like, I was disgusted. I didn't eat it. And I think that's like how injustice is even in spaces where there is a lot of justice occurring, like what Randy's saying, like the judges are making right decisions, da-da-da-da-da. If there's just a grain of injustice, it screams loudly, it demands the gaze of our eyes, and it really makes it feel like
it hurts.
It hurts.
Yeah.
Especially when you're the one who drew the short stick, as you asked.
Or, just in any way experiencing injustice. So in Ecclesiastes, the teacher talks about how the oppressed have no comforter. That's chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. It talks about how, even when you're oppressed, there isn't someone to comfort you, or in life sometimes. And then
that's like a double whammy.
Yeah.
It's like awful that there's oppression, and then it's awful that they have no comforter.
Yeah. And then the other one, also a double whammy.
Yeah.
It just says in chapter 7, verses 15 through 20, the idea is that righteous people can still live short lives, and wicked people can still live long lives. And that also, it just doesn't seem just. Or in another fashion,
another double whammy,
similar idea. Chapter 8, verses 8 through 17 has the idea that the righteous get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked get what the righteous deserve. We can see this in life too. It just doesn't seem fair. It seems unjust, and especially for people who are, really pursuing righteousness, and can't seem to have justice or be at peace or get what they deserve.
Yeah. And you can see how, if you look at these three things and you're making these observations, you could see how that could cause somebody to be like, well, is justice empty? Like, what's the point of even actively pursuing this when I see people who are being oppressed and nobody's even comforting them? Or I see people pursuing justice because they're righteous, but they live short lives, and it's actually the people who are perpetuating injustice who are living long or experiencing prosperity. That can lead you to a place of apathy really, really quick.
Yeah. And I think I'll add in here real quick, like, I think that includes both social justice, like all the realms of social justice, and also like, I don't know, life's injustices, like cancer, like, is it meaningless to pursue a cure for cancer? No, but, like, will we see justice in this world? I don't know. I hope so. I think, I don't know, it's stuff like that
like the varied ways that suffering individually touches our lives is a form of injustice.
Yeah, because we live in a broken world.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's very true. So there's injustices that are perpetuated by like systems and structures in our culture, like governments, like school systems, I don't know, whatever economics, whatever that may be. But there's also the reality of experiencing suffering in our life. It's that Ecclesiastes says time, death, and chance happen to us all. And by chance, I think suffering has touched our lives in many different ways that feels unjust. It feels like almost God has turned a blind eye. Moments where you really feel like you have no one to comfort you. So, Randi, now that we've painted a very bleak picture, do you have anything else you want to say?
Go ahead.
These are like I think we have 5 things that Ecclesiastes says, like 5 big picture things that we think Ecclesiastes tells us as we look at these realities, as we look at the reality of the oppressed having no comforter, as we look at the realities of the wicked prospering, the righteous not getting what they deserve. There's this trust that God will make things right. There's a faith that he'll make them right, and there's a trust in him. It's funny how at one point the author or the teacher says, I see all these bad things, but I know that it will go better for those who fear the Lord. And it's funny how so many times the teacher is saying, I see this, therefore I observe that this is meaningless. So it's very much like, I see, and here's my conclusion. I see, and here's my conclusion. And this is one of the few spots in the whole book where he says this, basically he's like, despite what I'm seeing, I know that it will go better for those who fear the Lord. So Ecclesiastes is very much saying, like, despite how things may seem, God can be trusted and things will go better for those who fear him. And that's very much like a statement of trust and faith. And I know that there's times in my life where, although I know that's true, my heart is not there. And I think we're dependent on the community around us to help us in those spaces. We're definitely dependent on God. I guess another point on there is we can trust God because at the very end, it talks about how God will bring into judgment the righteous and the wicked. It points towards our future hope that God, Jesus, our coming King, will indeed come and he will make everything right. In the Old Testament, when they speak of a judge, the judge is not only the person who executes the sentence, but also the person who makes things right. So this is a judgment where God doesn't just say, hey, this was wrong, but it's where God actually rights the wrong. And we have hope in a day that will happen. So what's next, Randi?
Another idea that we can learn from is paying attention to the sufferer, which we've talked about actually a few times in this series. Ecclesiastes touches on that there are those who have no comforter, and I guess the prayer is, let it not be so among us, let it not be so among Christ's body, that we can pay attention to those suffering. We can go to the house of mourning. We talked about that a few weeks ago. We can lead people to their biggest comforter in the Lord. Yeah.
So God will make things right. Pay attention to the sufferer, like offer them comfort. And then 3, take life a day at a time. Ecclesiastes tells us to not long for the former days. I mean, how often are we hearing that with even COVID right now? Like, I just wish days were like it was before COVID. And the author is like, that's not wise because that's not how things are right now. And that mindset's not going to equip you today. So when in the face of justice, don't long for things for how they used to be. Face them as they are right now. In the face of injustice, know that the righteous and the wise are in the hands of God, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So there's a sense in which we don't know what the future holds. We don't know we can't long for the past. And then in the present, do not be surprised when you do observe oppression. So there's this sense in which, like, don't long for the former days. You don't know what's coming. Don't be surprised when you see it in the present. And so just take life a day at a time. That's all that, honestly, we have the capacity. It's when we're trying to reach into the past or the future that I think we get really stressed and freaked out about justice. There's a sense in which Ecclesiastes is calling us to really take this a day at a time.
And then another one kind of going along with that is that there is enjoyment to be had in this life. The teacher often commends the enjoyment of life and says, eat, drink, and be merry, because this is what we've got. And so I guess as we take one day at a time to pay attention to the little moments that we can enjoy, that the Lord gives us pleasure in.
What you eat, what you drink, what specifically at one point it says in the wife of your youth. There's like relationships to delight in. Or in a sunny day. You love sunny days. Randy loves sunny days. You have no idea. So we have God will make things right. Pay attention to the sufferer. There's enjoyment to be had. And then lastly, calls us to walk in obedience. Again, in the very last chapter, the closing verses, it says, fear God and keep his commandments. There's verses that command us to be patient and not proud in Ecclesiastes. There's very much this view that calls the person who fears God to walk in his commandments. And really these commandments too, I think, have to do with enacting justice in the world around you. That's what the righteous do. They act wisely, they enact justice, they keep the Lord's commands. Again, as I said earlier, the teacher says, I know that it will be better for those who fear the Lord, and those who fear the Lord will keep his commands. So really, I think in regards to justice and injustice, Ecclesiastes says that the reality is we cannot expect to experience things as they ought to be all the time. But in the way things ought to be is they ought to be just and right. And the unfortunate reality is this world is broken. We cannot expect to experience things as they ought to be in this world. And that brokenness has even crept into the church at times. And I think the first job of the church is like to repent in those areas as individuals, as communities, as organizations. So the reality is we cannot expect to experience things as they ought to be all the time, but we are called by God. The God-fearer is called by him to participate in things becoming as they ought to be. So we cannot expect to experience things as they ought to be, but we're called to participate in things becoming as they ought to be. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Do you have like an easier way of saying that? You're a better communicator than I am sometimes.
I really was just thinking back on my example earlier, like I was just thinking about like with cancer, like it's not pointless to not try to find a cure. Like we are called to search for that cure. We're called to like find ways to overcome poverty. We're called to act in ways that overcome racism, and we are called. It all matters. We are called by God to participate in things becoming as they ought to be, which is fairness.
Yeah. But then to not be shocked when they aren't as they ought to be. Like when you do experience cancer, like it's awful. It is awful. even just bringing that up, it feels insensitive to use as a case study in a sermon because of how awful things like what we're bringing up are. But there's a sense in which the author is like, on this side of heaven, these things exist. And it is painful to talk about.
Yeah.
And it's painful to admit, and it's painful when you're in the midst of it.
Well, I guess we can use our example of infertility. Like, it's unjust, but we can't necessarily be surprised by it because the world is broken and we have to keep reassuring God and being called to participate with him in how it ought to be.
How they ought to be. That's right. And we have that invitation to participate in things being as they ought to be. So thank you for that. So I guess on that note, when we look at things that are just or unjust, I have a closing thought, and Randy has one too. When we look at things that are unjust, the reality is we're going to be experiencing full range of negative emotions, especially when we're confronted with it in our personal lives. We'll be experiencing anger, fear, sadness. Those are kind of like the big three negative emotions. Think of like Inside Out. Those were like, it was like, I guess disgust was in there too. And then there's just joy. But those three, think of anger, fear, sadness. We feel those all the time, often in response to injustice. And these emotions, as painful and as unwelcome as signs they are also signs that we were designed to have mastery of a world. Think of how how God, when he created man, he said, have dominion over the world. We were designed to have mastery of a world that inherently has injustice, danger, and loss. So in a sense, these emotions actually have a prophetic quality to them. Anger, fear, and sadness, they stir up in us a hope for things to come. These emotions can spur us to mission as they alert us to the places where God wants to bring justice, protection, and wholeness. So just as these negative emotions alert us to where there's injustice, danger, and loss, they can call us into mission to participate with God in bringing justice, protection, and wholeness to these very spaces. And that is what I believe the body of Christ is called to. That is what the teacher in Ecclesiastes is calling us to, even as we look out in this world that is full of pain and injustice at times.
And then a verse that many of us are pretty familiar with is Micah 6:8 that says, what does the Lord require of you but to act justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? And then furthering on with that, a rabbi said, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it.
So as the body of Christ, let us not abandon this work towards justice that we are called to. And again, on Sunday, we'll be looking at this from more of like a practical level, as we've already done a cursory view of what Ecclesiastes has to say. So thank you guys. See you Sunday.